Hello, hello, hello again, and thank you for joining us on another episode of the Y'all Don't Like Me podcast. I am super excited that you are here joining us, and I'm super excited about this interview that we have today. But first, I need you to hit that subscribe button. If you have not subscribed to the channel, to the podcast, then what are you waiting for? And while you're at it, hit that notification bell so that you can be informed every time we drop another podcast episode. Today, we have world-renowned scholar Dr. Craig Evans. Dr. Craig Evans is a distinguished professor of New Testament studies and Christian origins. He is a world-renowned scholar and historian who specializes in the historical research concerning Jesus. He received his Master's of Divinity from Western Baptist Seminary in Portland, Oregon, and his PhD in Biblical Studies from Claremont Graduate University in Southern California. He is the author of over 70 books and has hundreds of academic journals written. He is a teacher, a preacher, a lecturer, university and seminary professor, debater. He's a lot of things, and he's well known. And he's going to talk to us today about mythicism and the historicity of Jesus. Let's talk about it with Dr. Craig Evans. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another podcast episode. We are excited about this one. We have world-renowned scholar Dr. Craig Evans with us. I know you guys are excited right now, so I want you to thumb up the video, put a comment in the chat, dialogue with us. Let us know how you enjoyed this particular episode. And we kind of ran down Dr. Craig's bio. I can assure you that he has a wealth of knowledge that we're going to look to pull as much as we can in the short time that we have. I don't want to keep him here long, but I'll try to get as much out of him as I can. And Dr. Craig, I know I was talking with you a little bit earlier, but just want to take the time again to publicly thank you for gracing this podcast with your presence and also with your knowledge. And we truly appreciate all that you're going to give out to us on this evening. So let's get right into this, Dr. Craig. We live in a world that is often skeptical of things, and maybe even sometimes like a conspiracy theory or something. And so when we kind of get out of maybe our Christian church bubble, we run into different crowds that don't always believe what we believe, about Jesus. And so there are those out there who hold that maybe even Jesus never existed. And I know we'll get into this a little bit, that mythicism. But this being a channel that, deals with apologetics, I think it's good for us to be able to have knowledge about other people's positions, and then to be able to also have the ability to pose defenses where they need be. Also, within scholarship, obviously, about this. There have been many in the last couple hundred years, historical studies about Jesus and reconstructing the life of Jesus and those things. And so some in my audience may be familiar with that, some may not be. So I kind of want to begin to dive in kind of on a foundational level for the conversation that we're going to have on tonight. So I guess the first question that we'll start with is, within scholarship, what do we mean when we say, when we're talking about Jesus as a historical figure?
Well, every historian will give you, I think, the same definition. A historical figure, somebody who lived, and if that person was a major figure, even if it's antiquity 2,000 years ago, they leave behind in history what you might call our footprints. And so obviously people who are world leaders like Alexander the Great or Caesar Augustus or Herod the Great or any of figures like that, they leave huge footprints. They build buildings in their own honor.
Right.
People write about them. They leave behind inscriptions. Well, Jesus comes pretty close, and he's somebody who was a well-known Galilean prophet, teacher, healer, and his following thought, Son of God, Israel's Messiah. And so it's amazing how closely he compares to some of the Roman Caesars. When how many biographies do we have of Emperor Claudius or Tiberius? Well, 2, 3, maybe 4. How many biographies do we have of Jesus? Same number. We have 4
Right.
that are written within a generation of his life. And you have other people who are not part of his following talking about him. So this is what we mean about a historical figure. They leave behind footprints. There are actual traces, physical traces. And of course, for history, it's really helpful when it's written history. That's easier to interpret than just stones that we find, what we call the material remains of culture. In Jesus's case, we have all of that. We have contemporary discussion of him. We have people who, and we'll get into this, I know, a little later when we talk about mythicism, but we have people who know him, people who know his family, people who know his disciples, and they're all in that first generation. That's pretty good evidence. And then we have 4 biographies, and we have people outside his following who talk about him too. So is he a historical figure? He certainly is. And so he looms large, surprisingly, because he's not the emperor of the Roman Empire. He doesn't lead a huge army. He's not like Alexander the Great. He doesn't conquer half of the known world.
Right.
And yet, as a teacher from Galilee, he starts a movement that's huge and leaves all kinds of footprints. So is he a historical person? No question of it. But we'll nuance that some more as we continue to discuss this important topic.
Absolutely. That's a great foundation that you laid there. I'm excited about that. Now, Dr. Evans, I've been following him for a while, and we're going to put all of his links to where you can get all of his books. But let me tell you, he has a lot. Okay. He has more than, I believe, 70 books, and I got a few of them. I ain't got all 70 yet, but this is one that I'm working on reading through now. It's actually a 2-volume work, A History of the Quest for the Historical Jesus by Dr. Colin Brown and Dr. Craig Evans. This book right here, Jesus and His World, the Archaeological Evidence. This is really good. And I'm really loving the book Fabricating Jesus. And so how modern scholars distort the Gospels. And so those are just a couple of his books that if you want to even dig more into the subject matter that we're talking about, I would deeply suggest that you pick up those books, and we'll put the link also in the bio section so that you can even click on the rest of those books that Dr. Craig has. But Dr. Craig, you've been doing this for a while. You've had many debates about this topic. You are a scholar par excellence, but you're just one. So I want to know, what is the scholarly consensus? What are the scholars saying about this when this subject comes up in mainstream scholarship, those who are historians and New Testament scholars trained in this area to talk about this subject matter? What is that consensus? Are they saying, yes, like you, the Jesus is certainly a historical figure, or are they saying, no, he's not, or we don't know?
Well, that's a very good question. For scholars, it's a question that doesn't even need to be asked, but we're fully aware that the person in the street, the non-scholar, and it could be a very intelligent person. It could be a lawyer, a doctor, it could be an engineer, school teacher even, but a person who has no expertise in history or Christian origins or something like that, they could well be confused by these quacks who say Jesus never existed, the evidence is too feeble, and so forth. And they come up with these bizarre theories that Jesus is nothing more than a parable based on some Egyptian religious idea or something like that. The consensus among the real historians, whether they have a theological bent or not, whether they're confessional or not, whether they believe in God or not, whether they're a Christian or not, the consensus among real historians is Jesus most certainly did exist. Let me cite one scholar who passed away just a few months ago, the great E.P. Sanders, who spent his final years of his career and his life in North Carolina at Duke. E.P. Sanders brought out a very influential, much talked about, celebrated book called Jesus and Judaism, 1985. I mention it because he did not think of himself as an evangelical. Yes, he believed in God. He considered himself a Christian, but a fundamentalist he was not. Uncritical, he was not. He was a sharp scholar for a number of years. He was the Dean Ireland Professor of Holy Scripture in Oxford, so he's no chump. In his book, Jesus and Judaism, he argued that the existence of Jesus is not in question. He says, scholars agree that we know what Jesus said and we know what he did. that there's a general agreement. There may be some disagreement here and there on this or that, and then he listed several things where there's consensus. Jesus did these things, and Jesus taught these things. For example, he proclaimed the kingdom of God and routinely taught about the kingdom of God using parables. Nobody disagrees with that. That book, it carried the day. There was hardly any fuss at all. People quibbled over this or that, but not the main thesis or the presupposition of the book. So some of these, and I call them quacks, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to be offensive, but it irritates me that there are people who mislead the public. And it is shameful how they misuse historical sources and confuse naive people and think that, oh, there's a scholarly view out there that says Jesus never existed, or there never was a Jewish temple in Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. And these bad ideas have bad effects and confuse people, and people can make decisions on the basis of misinformation. And I think that's tragic. So I'm being very blunt about it. Yep. Real scholars don't question the existence of Jesus. They may quibble over this or that as to what Jesus taught or what he did or what the significance of it is, but that he existed, proclaimed the kingdom of God, was known by his contemporaries as a healer. There's no dispute about that.
This is good, Dr. Evans, and I'm glad you're being blunt. As I was talking to you earlier, I have some camps that I talk to and at different times, and I hear some of these bizarre and extreme positions of Jesus never existed, and the reasons why they give them, they just don't fit with the historical record. And so I'm glad you're bringing it out in this podcast, as you do in so many other platforms as well. So now, okay, so we're getting ready to get up to where we kind of talk about where, some of the positions of mythicism and those things. But before we get there, if you can kind of bring us up to speed, and I know I'm getting ready to ask you to kind of give us a summary of 100 and more years of historical research and reconstructing the life of Jesus, the quest, I guess, for the historical Jesus, and you're going to do that somehow in just a few minutes or whatever. But I would start out by saying, all right, when we're looking at the record, you were talking about, all the evidence, the Gospels, even those outside of the Gospels in the Bible that talked about Jesus. But for over 1,600 years, we don't have anyone, whether his followers or his foes, putting forth this position that Jesus never existed, and then we come up to a time around the Enlightenment period, and we start having these quests. And I believe Herman Ramirez, I think, might have been kind of one of the ones who we kind of deemed maybe most known for kind of starting these quests. Kind of just bring us up to a little speed. Where, when, and why, I guess, do we start having these quests for the historical Jesus?
Well, it's a good question. And Pastor Bennett, get out your stopwatch. Let me see if I can do this in 2 minutes.
Let's do it.
Well, as you know, in the 1500s, the Reformation got underway, and it got underway because of a resurgent interest in getting back to the sources. The Latin expression was ad fontes. That led to the Greek New Testament, a critical edition being printed. It led to the rediscovery of serious in-context exegesis, theology based on the text, and not tradition that was suspect. That was a huge advance in the 1500s. It leads to what we call the Enlightenment. And I think people need to know the Enlightenment, the reawakening of good thinking, scientific pursuit was grounded in a spiritual, exegetical, Christian intellectual awakening. They can't overlook that. Well, what then happened as we went into the 1600s, one or two skeptics thought, if we're bashing tradition, and that usually meant from a European point of view, bashing Roman Catholic tradition, maybe we ought to bash the church too. And the first known modern philosopher who suggested maybe Jesus didn't exist was in the 1600s. That is, by the way, the century in which Hermann Samuel Reimarus was born, the very person you mentioned. And so somebody thought maybe Jesus didn't exist. And you know why he suggested that? He didn't like the church's morals.
Wow.
And it's very interesting that behind mythicism and a lot of atheism is I don't want to be a good boy. I don't want to be righteous. I want to sin it up and I don't want any consequences. I know I'm poking some people right in the eye, but that's what's behind it. It's really interesting. And by the way, a 20th century atheist admitted it. He says, we don't want there to be a God. Why? We don't want the world to be that way. They want to live the way they want to live. So there's I would say, a sinful rebellion going on. Anyway, it's Reimarus himself. He believed Jesus existed. Right. He just didn't think the Gospels had it right. So he thought, well, maybe Jesus went to Jerusalem and tried to take over the government and install himself as the new king. And that is what triggered what we regard as the scholarly quest to historical Jesus. Now, it went into the 1800s. Well, Germany had reached a point of thinking, hey, we're scientific, we're intellectual, and I just can't wrap miracle around my head. Maybe miracle is myth. And the Gospels say Jesus performed miracles. Maybe this is all myth. And that's where David Strauss comes into the picture, and everybody's debating myth. So can we trust the Gospels? Jesus is kicking out demons. I mean, I don't understand this. And so skepticism began to arise. Well, in the middle of that, a guy named Bruno Bauer said, you know what? Jesus didn't even exist. And he wrote volumes trying to argue it was made up by the Roman Empire. They needed a scapegoat, blame the fire in Rome on some group. Well, what do we call them? I know. Let's call them Christians. And it's some of the silliest, embarrassing scholarship Germany ever produced. And it was in the 1840s. And somebody, you might know this name, Karl Marx, he picks up on that. He was a drinking buddy with Bruno Bauer. They would get drunk, ride donkeys through the streets of Berlin, and interrupt church services. That's the beginnings of Marxism. This stuff, there's no real intellectual gravitas here. And it burned out by the end of the 1800s into the early 1900s. And serious scholars said, this mythicism stuff is baloney. Of course, Jesus existed. Let's get serious, get back to the sources, get back to history, and figure it out. And so they nuanced the Gospels in certain ways, the form critics, the redaction critics, the new quest, and lately, the quest, the third quest, Tom Wright, well-known, Dale Allison and others, and of course, Colin Brown, the book, the 2 volumes you just mentioned, he's saying, let me help you trace this history out over 200 some years so you can make sense of it. That's how we got to where we are today. The good news, there's an openness to Jesus teaching some heavy-duty stuff about himself and exalted self-understanding. And when it comes to miracles, we back off and say, let's just be historians. Did Jesus do things that eyewitnesses and his contemporaries thought were just astounding and could only be explained as a work of God? And our answer is, yeah, that's what they thought. Yep. You can try to explain it away if you want, but from a historical point of view, Jesus's contemporaries, the eyewitnesses, were saying, this guy is doing things we have never seen before. That's where we are today.
Very good. I don't know how you did all that in that amount of time, because like you said, the 2-volume book has a lot more words than what Dr. Evans just did, but he got us started and gave us understanding of how we got here. That was great, Dr. Evans. So now let's go on to when we're talking about mythicism. Maybe you can even draw it out a little more. Mythicism within historical Jesus study. Give us maybe just a general understanding of, even kind of more than when you already have, really.
Sure.
Why maybe some of what their positions of why scholars on a consensus level reject that from mythicism, that Jesus never even existed.
Yeah, and here's a way of putting it, Pastor Bennett. If you have a theory that is constantly antagonistic toward the evidence, I recommend you get a new theory. And that's the problem. Mythicism spends all of its time trying to explain away all of the evidence. So friends, people who are listening to this very important podcast, take that to the bank. Yeah. If you got a theory that struggles with the evidence and has to poo-poo everything, trust me, that's a bad theory. And that's why mainstream scholarship doesn't go with it. You've got too many biographies, too much testimony in the church, outside the church. It's too early, too close to the figure we're talking about. Centuries haven't gone by. Myth hasn't arisen. We're talking about timely stuff in Jesus's time. Real scholars don't go with that. The last gasp was a fellow named Arthur Dreyfus in Germany, turn of the century, beginning of the 20th century. Last gasp, trying to argue for the Christ myth, flat outright rejected by conservatives, liberals alike, Jewish scholars too, by the way, Jewish scholars with no dog in the fight, so to speak. They said that's nonsense. Jesus existed. And that's where we are today. Mythicism today is nothing more than a crank, funny little thing out there. It's like a quirky little group trying to say, you know what, the earth isn't round, it's flat. You know what? The United States never went to the moon. I mean, it's in that category. But the average person in the street is deceived sometimes by that, and that's too bad. That's why I'm glad you're doing your podcast to set the record straight.
Yeah, that's good, Dr. Evans, because that's why we're doing this, because even from an apologetic standpoint of being able to, like you said, set the record straight. This theory of Jesus never existing, it is something that we shouldn't even consider. It's not biblical, it's not historical, it's not scholarly. And so I think we should dismiss it, but be able to explain why, right? Why it's not something that we should even entertain. And so with that, I guess I want to have kind of two of the same questions, Dr. Evans, but I'll kind of rearrange the order a little bit. And I guess we can start off with, since we're talking about mythicism, what are maybe three, just a couple of the weakest arguments that mythicists put forth? You really kind of stated one of them, because one of the things they do is no matter what evidence you put forth, they just disregard it or explain it away as, a Christian interpolation or so on and so forth. So, but just from your research and the different discussions and debates that you have, what would you say are some of the weakest arguments that they put forth, maybe as strong arguments, but are really weak arguments to Jesus never existed? Here's why.
Yeah, the weakest argument is the way they have to dismiss all the relevant evidence. That's huge. And I'll go to the arguments in favor of Jesus in just a moment and show why. But they have to dismiss all the evidence. So they don't trust the Gospels, they don't trust Josephus, they don't trust Tacitus, Suetonius, Lucian. They just reject everybody. The second real weak thing is their explanation then for where Jesus came from.
Wow.
That's colossally weak. Yeah. And so this idea that he becomes a literary embodiment that someone has composed in the late first century, second century, whenever, a parable, as it were, about a man who never existed, who embodies an Egyptian idea of the light or something like that. And they have different variations of it. And they say, oh, well, this existed in the primitive world in different places. Well, what they create never existed anywhere. They take a piece here, a piece there, and they cobble together what I call Frankenstein. Yep. They create this guy out of different body parts. And the real problem is that some of those body parts that they use to assemble what they think is a precursor to Jesus, some of it's post-Christian. It's stuff that's later. And what they don't realize is that some of the critics of Christianity in the second and third centuries, I mean, Christianity had plenty of critics. Absolutely. And if Jesus didn't exist, you just know the critics would have jumped on that one.
Exactly.
And what the critics did in the second and third century, I'm thinking of Celsus, I'm thinking of Porphyry and some others, they'd say, oh, well, there's nothing so special about Jesus. He's just doing stuff that others have done before. And so some of the old pagan myths that are truly pre-Christian, first century BC, second century BC, and so on, they would redefine them in light of what Jesus did. And so when the mythicist creates this image, he's borrowing stuff from first, second, third century AD and running it back into the pre-Christian period. So there's anachronism throughout. That's the problem. And by the way, the real historians and the historians of religious history and so on, they know that. That's why they don't buy it. They say, you guys are completely wrong. So now let me flip the other side of the coin. What's the best evidence for the existence of Jesus. And this, of course, is what refutes mythicism. Number one, we have multiple biographies. We don't have just one.
Right.
We don't have one story about Jesus written 200 years after he died. We have four,
Yep.
three of them written within one generation. If the crucifixion took place either near 30 or 33, those are the two top candidates. I tilt toward 30, but 33 some go with. And by the way, the reason we have a chronological problem is because of Josephus. That's why, and where he dates when Herod the Great died. So it's not a problem for Christians, it's a problem for Josephus. In any case, if Jesus dies on the cross in 30 or 33, well, when are the Gospels written? Well, the three synoptics are written within a generation. So, and there have been calculations about how many eyewitnesses would still be alive, and there'd be a percentage of them, maybe 20%. The idea of creating somebody that didn't exist is just impossible. Then John's Gospel's written a little later, perhaps 55, 60 years after Easter. So you have four biographies, three of them within a generation. But here's the killer, Pastor Bennett. It's Paul.
Oh,
In letters that are not disputed, even by the mythicists. Which letters? Galatians, First Corinthians. Ignore everything else if you wish. Those two letters, Paul talks about Jesus's own disciples, whom he has met.
Yep.
And that includes the Apostle Peter and the Apostle John, the two top disciples. Yep. And he's met James, the brother of Jesus.
Yep.
And as one scholar said, you know, if Jesus didn't exist, you'd think his brother James would have known that.
Exactly.
I mean, that's pretty hard hitting. Yeah. And by the way, he's not complimenting these people. He's not kissing up to them. Right. He's saying, I had to scold Peter. He wouldn't eat lunch with Gentiles when men with James. You know, Paul say, look, hey, I work harder than these other guys. So this is not some kind of love-in. Yeah. This is hard hitting. Paul's not kissing up to anybody. In fact, Paul wants to make it clear he got his understanding of the gospel from Jesus himself. Yep. But he knows Peter, John, James, the family, others, reputed pillars. Yes, he knows them. Yes, he discussed his understanding of the gospel with them. Yes, they gave him the right hand of fellowship. Yep. Now, that's a killer because this is written even before the Gospels. He's saying this in the late 40s, early 50s. Christianity is still new. He passes on his tradition. In 1 Corinthians 15, he says, what I received, yep, I pass on to you. And he goes on to talk about Jesus. He died, was buried, and was raised on the third day. And scholars say this tradition that Paul received was received when he was converted. Yep. And when was that? 1.5 or 2 years after Easter. Yep. Christianity is in its infancy, and Christians are telling him about what Jesus did, how he died, how he's buried, how he's raised up. He's received that then. Yeah. The idea of Jesus actually never existed, he's some kind of cosmic thing up in outer space, is ludicrous. And the scholars know that. It's important, Pastor Bennett, for you and me to make it clear to everybody else, the laity, that that's the case.
Man, this is some good stuff, Dr. Evans. That was amazing. Like you said, Paul is a killer, because we don't believe the Gospels. Okay, well, what about Paul? He was before the Gospels, and he said he meant the brother of James. And I don't know too many myths that never existed to have living brothers. Yeah. And some even go as far. One goes as far as that I talked to is they deny that Jesus ever existed, and then when you bring up Paul, they deny that Paul ever existed, and that's where you just know it's getting extreme, and they're just throwing all the information away. I don't want to hold you too much longer, Dr. Evans, but let me ask you one more question. It wasn't on our list, but I know you'll be able to kind of give it because you mentioned Josephus, you mentioned Tacitus. When it comes to Tacitus, where do you land as it pertains to where he would have sourced his information from, possibly? And do you see when he's calling, the Christianity and these Christians having this superstition. Do you see that as kind of from a standpoint of the criteria of embarrassment that a Christian would have never said that about, Christianity, to make it kind of for us to understand that, this is more authentically what Tacitus is just sourcing it, why he's talking about the fire in Nero?
Oh, you're absolutely correct. The very brief comments that we have in Suetonius, I might add Pliny, the governor,
Yep.
writing about 111 AD, something like that. He mentions the Christians. So you have Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny, and then a little later you have Lucian,
Mhm.
and they don't say anything that flatters Christianity.
No.
They regard it as a superstition. They regard it as unhealthy. They think Christians should be persecuted. They don't. They clearly do not understand the Christian message. They don't say anything about Jesus dying on the cross for sins or being raised up. They just think it's some kind of superstition. They don't know if Christians are Jews or what they are exactly. And they gather together and have some kind of meal. But one of them, Pliny says he interrogated. When Rome interrogates you, it ain't fun. But he interrogated some Christians, killed a few of them, and he tells Emperor Trajan, actually, it's a harmless meal. And you know what's behind that? I think you know, is the charge of cannibalism, which grows right out of the words of institution. This is my body, this is my blood. So this is a testimony. It's left-handed, to be sure, but it's a testimony to the authentic Jesus, the authentic tradition, even if garbled and even if presented in a very prejudicial manner. And that's from outsiders who have no sympathy for Christianity at all. If they suspected Jesus never lived, they would have preached that from the rooftops. That would have made their point. But no, they know he existed. He just wasn't any good, and he clearly was false.
Yeah. So, in my final question, just kind of in closing, and you kind of touched on it throughout, our conversation, as this is important for us to talk about, and to deal with, because like you said, people that may not be informed about the subject matter may get tricked by some of these claims that are clearly false. So just from an apologetic standpoint, Dr. Evans, how important would you say it is for Christians and believers to at least familiarize themselves with, we read the Bible, read the Gospels, the New Testament, the Old Testament, but how important would you say, just from an apologetic standpoint, maybe we should start understanding even some things outside of the Bible that support, our faith?
Oh, you're absolutely right. Robert Van Voort has a very good book on testimony about Jesus outside of the New Testament. That's a very important book. You need to know this stuff. And one way to sum it up is this: the Gospels are early, they are reliable, and scholars and archaeologists know this. I know archaeologists, if they're interested in first century Israel, digging relating to that, they always want to know what's in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts, and Josephus. They would never dig without them. And if these gospels were mythological and full of mistakes and unreliable, they would not use them.
Yeah.
And this high view of the gospels comes from Israeli archaeologists, Jewish archaeologists, not just Christian. So if you're going to move 50 tons of dirt and get 100 people to volunteer and help you do that, and invest $300,000 or $400,000 in doing that, you want to know where to dig and how to understand it, or you're out of business.
Yep.
And they always use Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So don't take it from me. Take it from the guys who move tons of earth every summer in Israel.
That's good. Well, listen, I know our audience enjoyed you. I've enjoyed you. And this is just a little taste of what you can get from Dr. Craig Evans. We're going to have his information below, his website, links to his books. You can look him up anywhere. Google him. You can Google Dr. Craig Evans. You're going to find a lot of information about him. Dr. Evans, I appreciate you, sir. Thank you for not just being on this show, but thank you for all you've done for the faith. And we appreciate you, and thank you for blessing our podcast on today. We appreciate it.
Thank you. You're most welcome.